June 1941. The Soviet Union is under attack. 4 million German soldiers pour across the border in Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion force in human history. In the chaos of retreat, near a small Lithuanian village called Raseiniai, 5 Soviet tank crewmen would make a decision that would stop the German 6th Panzer Division in its tracks for an entire day and night. This is the story of one KV-1 heavy tank and the crew that refused to surrender. The Kliment Voroshilov tank, known as the KV-1, named after the Soviet defense commissar. This machine was a monster. 45 tons of Soviet steel, armor up to 90 millimeters thick in some places, a 76.2 millimeter main gun that could kill any German tank, and machine guns to cut down infantry. Inside this steel fortress lived 5 men: the commander who directed the battle, the gunner who aimed and fired the main weapon, the loader who fed shells into the breach, the driver who steered this 45-ton beast, and the radio operator who also fired the hull machine gun. They operated in cramped, deafening conditions. The smell of diesel fuel, gunpowder, and sweat. The roar of the engine so loud that communication was difficult. The heat in summer could reach 120 degrees inside, but the KV-1 gave them something no other Soviet tank could: protection. When the KV-1 was designed in 1939, Soviet engineers had learned bitter lessons from the Spanish Civil War and the Winter War with Finland. They knew that tanks needed heavy armor to survive modern battlefields. The KV-1's armor was revolutionary for its time. German 37mm anti-tank guns bounced shells off it like pebbles. Even the 50mm guns on early Panzer III tanks could not penetrate the KV-1's frontal armor. German tankers who first encountered the KV-1 called it the Russian Colossus and the monster. They were terrified of it. But the KV-1 was not without weaknesses. It was slow, with a top speed of just 21 miles per hour on roads, much slower cross-country. Its transmission was unreliable and broke down frequently. The turret turned slowly, making it vulnerable to faster enemy tanks. And visibility from inside was poor. The crew relied on small vision slits and periscopes. Often they had no idea what was happening around them. But in June 1941, as Operation Barbarossa began, the KV-1's strengths far outweighed its weaknesses. The Soviet Union had about 500 KV-1 tanks, and the Germans were completely unprepared for them. June 22, 1941, 3:15 a.m. Along a 1,800-mile front from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, German artillery opened fire. 3 million German soldiers, along with hundreds of thousands of allies, crossed the Soviet border. Hitler's plan was simple but brutal: destroy the Red Army in massive encirclement battles, capture Moscow, Leningrad, and the oil fields of the Caucasus, conquer the Soviet Union before winter. In the north, Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, drove toward Leningrad through the Baltic states. Leading the assault was General Erich von Manstein's 56th Panzer Corps, including the 6th Panzer Division. The Soviet forces in the Baltic were caught completely by surprise. Stalin had refused to believe intelligence reports of the impending attack. Soviet units were not on alert. Ammunition was stored in depots far from the front. Communications were disrupted by German air attacks. Commanders had no idea where their units were or what was happening. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, destroyed hundreds of Soviet aircraft. On the ground, on the first day, Soviet tank units tried to counterattack, but without coordination, without air support, without supplies, they were cut to pieces by German combined arms tactics. The German advance was terrifying in its speed. 30 miles on the first day, 50 miles on the second. The Soviet Northwestern Front was collapsing. Tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers were being surrounded and captured. Hundreds of tanks were abandoned when they ran out of fuel. It seemed nothing could stop the German war machine. Near the Lithuanian town of Raseiniai, the Soviet 3rd and 12th Mechanized Corps attempted to stop the German advance. These were some of the Red Army's best equipped units. They had hundreds of tanks, including T-34s and KV-1s. On June 23, 1941, the Soviet 2nd Tank Division attacked elements of the German 6th Panzer Division near the village of Skoudville. It was here that German forces first encountered the KV-1 in combat. The results were shocking. A German officer later wrote, "The KV-1 and KV-2 which we first met here were really something. Our companies opened fire at about 800 yards, but it remained ineffective. We moved closer and closer to the enemy. who for his part continued to approach us unconcerned. Very soon we were facing each other at 50 to 100 yards. A fantastic exchange of fire took place without any visible German success. The Russian tanks continued to advance, and all armor-piercing shells simply bounced off them. German tankers watched in horror as their best armor-piercing rounds sparked off the KV-1's armor without penetrating. Some Soviet tanks, even when they ran out of ammunition, simply drove over German anti-tank guns, crushing them and their crews. The German 6th Panzer Division was equipped with Czech-made Panzer 35T light tanks. These were completely outmatched. For the first time since the invasion began, the German advance slowed, but the Soviet counterattack was poorly coordinated. Units attacked piecemeal without air support. The Luftwaffe bombed Soviet tank columns from the air, setting dozens of vehicles ablaze. German anti-aircraft guns, the famous 88mm flak, were pressed into service as anti-tank weapons. They proved to be the only weapon that could reliably destroy KV-1s. By June 24th, the Soviet counterattack was spent. The 3rd and 12th Mechanized Corps had lost hundreds of tanks, not just to German guns but to mechanical breakdowns and lack of fuel. The German 6th Panzer Division had secured bridgeheads over the Dubisa River. The road to deeper Soviet territory lay open, or so they thought. On the morning of June 24th, 1941, a German supply convoy was moving captured Soviet prisoners and wounded German soldiers from the front line back toward Raseiniai. They approached a crossroads on the main supply road, a critical junction that connected the German forward units to their supply depots in the rear. Without warning, a KV-1 tank appeared, sitting directly in the middle of the crossroads, blocking the road. The Soviet tank opened fire. German trucks erupted in flames. The convoy turned and fled. Local Lithuanian villagers later reported that the tank had driven up to that position the night before and simply stopped, as if waiting. This single tank now sat astride the main German supply route. The crew inside made a decision. They would not retreat. They would not abandon their position. They would fight. For the next 24 hours, this lone KV-1 and its crew of 5 men would hold off an entire German division. General Erhard Raus, commander of Kampfgruppe Raus, part of the 6th Panzer Division, received reports of the Soviet tank. At first he thought it might be the beginning of another Soviet counterattack, but scouts reported it was just one tank sitting at a crossroads, blocking the division's supply line. Raus ordered his forward units to destroy it immediately. Another German convoy approached, this time carrying fuel and ammunition for the frontline troops. Desperately needed supplies for the continued advance. The KV-1 opened fire again. Its 76.2mm gun spoke with deadly accuracy. Fuel trucks exploded in towering fireballs. Ammunition trucks detonated in thunderous blasts. The convoy was annihilated. Throughout the day, the Soviet tank crew destroyed 12 German trucks. Raus realized he had a serious problem. His division was effectively cut in two. Forward units could not receive ammunition, fuel, or food. Wounded could not be evacuated to the rear. One Soviet tank was causing chaos. Far out of proportion to its size, the German anti-tank units moved forward. They deployed their 50mm Pak-38 anti-tank guns. These were the standard German anti-tank weapons, effective against most Soviet tanks. The gunners carefully sighted their weapons, loaded armor-piercing shells, and fired. The shells struck the KV-1's armor and bounced off harmlessly. The Soviet tank turret began to traverse. Slowly, methodically, it turned toward the German position. The main gun fired. The German anti-tank gun and its crew were annihilated. Another gun fired, another miss. The KV-1 returned fire. Another German gun destroyed. The 50mm guns of the 6th Panzer Division's anti-tank battalion were useless against this monster. General Raus ordered up heavier weapons. 105mm howitzers were brought forward. These artillery pieces fired high explosive shells, designed to destroy infantry positions and buildings, not to penetrate armor. But the Germans hoped the blast might damage the tank, or at least suppress its crew. The howitzers opened fire. Shells exploded around the KV-1. Dirt and debris showered the tank. But the thick armor protected the crew. The tank sat unmoved. And then it fired back. The Soviet gunner had spotted the German artillery positions. One by one, the KV-1 destroyed the howitzers. German casualties mounted. Inside the tank, the crew worked in a practiced rhythm. The commander spotted targets through his periscope. The gunner traversed the turret and aimed the main gun. The loader hefted 28-pound shells, slamming them into the breech as fast as he could. The driver kept the engine running, ready to maneuver if necessary. The radio operator scanned for approaching infantry. His machine gun ready, they were exhausted. The heat inside the tank was oppressive. The smell of cordite from the fired shells burned their lungs. Their ears rang from the constant noise, but they continued to fight. As evening approached, General Rouse made a decision. He ordered one of his most valuable weapons brought forward, an 88mm flak gun. The 88 was originally designed as an anti-aircraft weapon, but it had proven effective against tanks in the Spanish Civil War. Its high-velocity shells could penetrate thick armor. If the Germans had any weapon that could kill the KV-1, this was it. Under cover of approaching darkness, German crews carefully moved an 88mm flak gun into position, about 730 meters behind the Soviet tank. They worked in silence, terrified of being spotted. The gun was heavy and difficult to maneuver, but it was their best chance. As night fell, the 88 crew prepared to fire. They loaded an armor-piercing shell, aimed at the rear of the KV-1 where the armor was thinnest, and fired. But somehow, impossibly, the Soviet tank commander spotted the muzzle flash. The KV-1's turret traversed rapidly. The main gun fired. The German 88 and its entire crew were destroyed before they could get off a second shot. General Rouse was furious. One of his precious 88mm guns had been lost, and the Soviet tank still held the crossroads. As night deepened, the German commander considered his options. He could not simply bypass the tank. There were no alternative routes through the marshy terrain. The crossroads was the only way to resupply his forward units. He could not wait for the tank to run out of ammunition. His troops at the front needed supplies urgently. And who knew how much ammunition the Soviet crew had? Infantry assault was out of the question. German soldiers who tried to approach on foot were cut down by the tank's machine guns. Rouse ordered another 88 brought forward. This time he would be more careful. Inside the KV-1, the crew knew they were running low on shells. They had started with about 110 rounds of main gun ammunition. After a full day of combat, perhaps 30 or 40 rounds remained. Machine gun ammunition was also dwindling. The driver reported that fuel was getting low. The engine had been running almost continuously. They had no food and only limited water. The heat inside the tank was brutal. Every man was soaked in sweat. But they had held their position for an entire day. They had stopped a German Panzer Division, and they were not done yet. June 25, 1941, dawn. The Soviet tank still held the crossroads. General Rouse had assembled a force to destroy it. Another 88mm flak gun, a platoon of combat engineers with explosive charges, and a company of infantry to provide covering fire. This time they would use combined tactics. The 88 would be positioned carefully, camouflaged. Infantry would suppress the tank with rifle and machine gun fire, while engineers crept forward with satchel charges. At first light, the German attack began. Infantry opened fire from multiple directions. Bullets pinged off the KV-1's armor, making it difficult for the Soviet crew to spot targets. Under this covering fire, German engineers began crawling toward the tank. Each man carried a satchel charge, a canvas bag filled with explosives. The plan was to place charges on the tank's tracks, immobilizing it so the 88 could finish it off. Inside the tank, the radio operator spotted movement through his vision slit. He opened fire with his machine gun. German engineers fell, their charges unexploded. Others managed to reach the tank. They placed charges on the left track and scrambled away before detonating them. The explosions rocked the KV-1. The left track was damaged. The driver tried to move, but the tank could barely turn. The KV-1 was now immobilized, but its guns still worked. The 88mm flak gun opened fire. This gun was positioned much more carefully, hidden in the tree line with a clear line of sight to the rear of the Soviet tank. The first shell struck the engine compartment. Smoke began pouring from the KV-1. The second shell hit the turret ring. The turret jammed. The third and fourth shells penetrated the rear armor. Fire erupted inside the tank, but incredibly, the Soviet crew continued fighting. The machine gun was still firing. German infantry could not approach. The 88 fired again and again, 7 direct hits in total. Finally, the machine gun fell silent. Smoke and flames poured from the stricken tank. After 24 hours of continuous combat, the KV-1 was destroyed. German soldiers cautiously approached the burning tank. They were amazed at what they saw. The KV-1's armor was cratered with impact marks, dozens of hits from anti-tank guns that had failed to penetrate, scorch marks from high-explosive shells, but only the 7 hits from the 88 had done serious damage. Around the tank lay the wreckage of destroyed German vehicles, at least 12 supply trucks, 2 anti-tank guns, 1 88mm flak gun, and a 105mm howitzer. German casualties were estimated at over 20 killed, and many more wounded, all from one Soviet tank and its crew of 5 men. General Rouse later wrote in his memoirs, "The tank remained in our possession. It had been hit by numerous rounds, which all, with the exception of the strikes from the 88mm flak, had been unable to penetrate the armor. When German soldiers finally opened the tank's hatches, they found the bodies of the 5 crew members. All had died at their posts. The Germans, recognizing the extraordinary courage of these unknown Soviet tankers, buried them with full military honors. A German officer gave a eulogy, praising their bravery and skill. A rifle salute was fired over their graves. This was unusual in the brutal Eastern Front War, where respect for the enemy was rare. But these German soldiers recognized that they had witnessed something extraordinary. 5 men, isolated and alone, had fought to the death against overwhelming odds. They had held their position and never surrendered. For decades, the identities of the 5 Soviet tankers remained unknown. Soviet records from the chaotic early days of Barbarossa were incomplete or lost. Entire units were destroyed with no survivors to report what happened. The story of the KV-1 at the crossroads existed primarily in German accounts. But in recent years, Russian historians and researchers have worked to identify the crew. The tank likely came from the 2nd Tank Division of the 3rd Mechanized Corps, based on the location and timing of the battle. Some researchers believe the commander may have been Senior Lieutenant Semyon Konovalov, a tank officer who was listed as missing in action near Raseiniai on June 24, 1941. His crew members, if this identification is correct, would have been his regular team, men he had trained with, fought with, and ultimately died with. We may never know their names with certainty, but we know what they did. In the face of overwhelming odds, with no hope of rescue or reinforcement, they chose to fight. They held a vital crossroads for 24 hours, stopping a German Panzer Division in its tracks, destroying German vehicles and weapons, and delaying the German advance. Even if only for a day, 1 tank, 5 men, 24 hours. Could it really matter in a war involving millions of soldiers? The answer is yes. The Battle of Raseiniai was one of the first times German forces encountered heavy Soviet tanks in significant numbers. The KV-1 and T-34 came as a complete shock. German intelligence had badly underestimated Soviet tank capabilities. German tankers discovered their weapons were inadequate. The 37mm and 50mm guns on German tanks and anti-tank guns could not penetrate KV-1 armor. This forced the Germans to adapt their tactics. They began using 88mm Flak guns as anti-tank weapons. They called for Luftwaffe support against Soviet tanks. They developed new armor-piercing ammunition, and they accelerated development of heavier German tanks. The stand of the KV-1 at the crossroads became legendary among German soldiers. It was proof that Soviet resistance could be fierce, even in retreat, even when surrounded. The 6th Panzer Division's advance was delayed, not by much in the grand scheme. But every day, every hour mattered. Operation Barbarossa was based on achieving quick victory before the Russian winter arrived. Every delay, no matter how small, brought the Germans closer to the winter that would ultimately stop them. In that sense, 5 men in a tank, holding a crossroads for 1 day, made a difference. What drives men to fight when hope is lost? Why did the KV-1 crew not simply abandon their tank? They could have slipped away in the night, tried to reach Soviet lines. Instead, they stayed and fought until death. Part of the answer lies in the Soviet military culture of 1941. Soviet soldiers were taught that retreat was treason. Stalin's infamous Order 270, issued in August 1941, declared that soldiers who surrendered were enemies of the people. Their families could be arrested. But this crew made their stand before Order 270 existed. So perhaps the answer is simpler. Perhaps it was duty. They had a mission to defend Soviet territory. They had a position that mattered strategically. And they had each other. Tank crews developed intense bonds, living and fighting in a steel box, where every man's life depended on his comrades. They were brothers in the truest sense. Perhaps they fought because they would not abandon each other. Perhaps they fought because running seemed more terrifying than staying in their fortress of steel. Whatever their reasons, these 5 men showed extraordinary courage. They turned their tank into a monument, not of metal but of human will. After the war, the story of the KV-1 at Raseiniai became part of Soviet military legend. Though the crew's names remained unknown for decades, their action was celebrated as an example of Soviet determination and sacrifice. In Germany, the story also endured. General Erhard Raus included it in his memoirs. German veterans told and retold the tale of the monster tank that wouldn't die. In modern Russia, memorials have been erected near Raseiniai to honor the unknown tank crews who fought there in June 1941. Military historians study the battle to understand early Soviet tank tactics and German responses to heavy armor. The story has been featured in books, documentaries, and even video games. But beyond its historical and tactical significance, the story resonates because it's fundamentally human. 5 ordinary men faced with an impossible situation did something extraordinary. They remind us that courage is not the absence of fear, but acting despite fear. That duty can transcend self-preservation, and that even in the darkest moments of war, human beings can rise to incredible heights. Conclusion: The Last Stand. On a dusty crossroads in Lithuania, in June 1941, 5 Soviet tank crewmen wrote their names in history, not with ink but with fire and steel. For 24 hours they held their ground. Against a German Panzer Division, they destroyed enemy vehicles and weapons. They disrupted the German timetable. And they never surrendered. Their KV-1 tank became a fortress that the German army had to reduce with its heaviest weapons. When it was finally destroyed, even their enemies honored them. Today we remember not just their tactical achievement, but what it represents: the power of determination, the strength of brotherhood, and the courage to stand fast. When everything says you should run, 5 men, 1 tank, 1 day. A story for the ages.